Professor Thomas Weber stood motionless in his grandfather's study, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light as he traced his fingers along the spines of countless philosophical texts. His eyes settled on a burgundy leather volume, an annotated, first edition of Schopenhauer's essays, including On Women. Inside, his grandfather's meticulous handwriting filled the margins, creating a decades-long dialogue with the philosopher's most controversial ideas. "This is extraordinary," Thomas whispered, ignoring the lawyer waiting patiently by the door with final inheritance papers. That evening, he sat at his grandfather's desk, the Schopenhauer text open before him, silencing yet another message from Elena, his ex-wife. 6 months after their divorce, the philosopher's pessimistic views on desire and suffering resonated with painful clarity. Elise Brenner looked up from her dissertation notes when she heard about Professor Weber's unexpected return from sabbatical to teach a seminar on Schopenhauer's philosophy of human relations. "I thought he was still recovering from his divorce," she said to her fellow doctoral student. Later, standing outside Weber's office, Elise knocked with purpose. "Professor Weber, I'd like to join your Schopenhauer seminar. My dissertation has shifted to focus on the concept of will in post-Kantian philosophy." Thomas studied her with newfound interest. Most students dismiss Schopenhauer's views on women as merely the bitter musings of a lonely misogynist. "That's an oversimplification," Elise countered. "His ideas about desire being destructive apply to everyone, but he focused on female desire because of his own complicated relationships, especially with his mother." Thomas leaned back, intrigued despite himself. "The seminar begins next Tuesday." Schopenhauer views the will, the fundamental driving force of existence, as blind, insatiable, and ultimately the source of all suffering, Thomas explained to the seminar students arranged in a circle. Spring sunlight streamed through windows overlooking the university's botanical garden. After class, Thomas found himself walking alongside Elise through blooming flowers. "Your grandfather's annotated edition. May I ask what kinds of notes he made on women?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. He seemed to be engaged in a decades-long argument with Schopenhauer. In his earlier notes, he appeared to agree with many assertions. Later, he became more critical. He paused. "My grandfather never married. I've often wondered if his relationship with these ideas shaped that choice. Or perhaps his own experiences shaped how he read Schopenhauer," Elise suggested. "We all bring our personal histories to philosophy." Thomas glanced at her. "Are you suggesting I'm doing the same?" "Aren't we all?" Elise replied. "The question is whether we're aware of it." Elena arrived precisely at 6 to collect her mother's paintings. Her dark hair was shorter now, and she wore a red coat Thomas had never seen before. "You look well," he said awkwardly. "You don't," she replied frankly. "Are you sleeping?" "Research has been consuming my time. I'm teaching a seminar on Schopenhauer." Elena rolled her eyes. "Of course you are, the philosopher of pessimism, perfect for you right now." "His insights on desire and suffering are profound," Thomas defended. "The will drives us to pursue things that ultimately can't satisfy us. Isn't that exactly what happened with us? Is that how you've rationalized it? That our marriage was doomed by some philosophical concept of insatiable desire?" "You were the one who said you felt unfulfilled," Thomas countered, "because you were never actually present, Thomas. You lived in your books, in dead men's ideas." She finished wrapping the last painting. "And now you're using one of those dead men to avoid facing your part in what happened." After she left, Thomas returned to his grandfather's study and poured himself a generous whiskey, turning to a heavily annotated passage where his grandfather had written, "But isn't male desire equally enslaved to nature's purposes? S fails to account for his own will, operating behind his objective analysis. In the university archives, Thomas discovered letters between his grandfather and a woman named Margaret Eisler, spanning nearly 2 decades. The correspondence mentioned discussions of Schopenhauer and referred to our disagreement regarding his views on the female will. Thomas enlisted Elise's help in researching this mysterious woman. They discovered Margaret had been one of the few female philosophy students at the university in the early 1960s who later became a respected scholar. She published several papers on Schopenhauer, Elise reported, including this one, The Gendered Will, Schopenhauer's misappropriation of desire. She directly challenges his characterization of female desire as destructive. Thomas read the abstract with growing interest. This paper examines how Schopenhauer's personal experiences, particularly his troubled relationship with his mother and his unsuccessful romantic pursuits, colored his philosophical treatment of gender and desire. Further research revealed a manuscript they had apparently worked on together, titled The Redemption of Desire, a critical response to Schopenhauer's gender philosophy. Your grandfather and this woman were intellectual partners, Elise said, and perhaps more. The seminar had grown increasingly tense as Thomas found himself defending Schopenhauer's views more rigidly, particularly regarding gender and desire. Schopenhauer believed women were incapable of the disinterested contemplation necessary for true aesthetic experience, Thomas explained, because they remained too firmly in the grip of the will's practical concerns. That's demonstrably false, a student objected. Elise spoke up. Professor, you're presenting Schopenhauer's views without critical context. His assertions about women's aesthetic capacities weren't based on evidence, but on his preconceptions. After class, their disagreement escalated in his office. Professor Weber, I respect you as a scholar, but I have to ask, are you using Schopenhauer to process your own experiences? Because it seems you're becoming increasingly invested in his most misogynistic ideas. That's completely inappropriate, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Is it? Elise challenged. Because when you talk about desire being destructive, about women being governed by blind will rather than reason, I hear someone trying to make sense of personal pain through philosophy. The rain had been falling steadily for hours when Elise knocked at Thomas's door, a folder clutched protectively under her coat. I found something you need to see, she said simply. Inside were photocopied documents from Margarete Eisler's personal papers, an unpublished manuscript responding to Schopenhauer's On Women that she had co-written with his grandfather. The typescript was heavily annotated in 2 distinct handwritings. They were collaborators, Elise explained, and more than that, there are personal letters here too. They had a profound relationship that spanned decades, though they never married. Thomas read his grandfather's words from one letter. I find myself caught between Schopenhauer's wisdom and your challenge to it. He warns that desire leads inevitably to disappointment, that the will can never be satisfied. You argue that it is not desire itself, but fear of it that causes suffering. My grandfather chose Schopenhauer over love, Thomas said quietly. I'm not sure it's that simple, Elise replied. Their relationship continued for years. I think your grandfather was working through Schopenhauer's ideas his entire life, trying to reconcile them with his feelings for Margaret. Thomas began, reading their manuscript, finding himself moved by the intellectual partnership revealed in the marginalia. Questions posed by one answered by the other, disagreements noted respectfully, insights building upon each other. I'm getting married again, Eleanor said directly during her unexpected visit. I'm moving to Munich next month. Thomas felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. He'd expected to feel jealousy or anger, but instead found himself experiencing a profound sadness, not for the loss of Elena, but for the years he'd wasted hiding in philosophy rather than living. "I'm happy for you," he said, surprised to find he meant it. "Who is he?" "She," Elena corrected gently. "Her name is Claudia. She's an architect." Thomas absorbed this information, recognizing it as another way he'd failed to truly know his former wife. Later, he found an entry in his grandfather's journal from 1987, the year of Margaret's death from cancer. "M left this world today. With her goes the finest mind I've ever known and the bravest heart. She taught me that Schopenhauer was wrong about the destructiveness of desire. It was never desire that destroyed, but fear of it. I was afraid for so long, and she waited patiently for me to find courage. Now she is gone, and I am left with the knowledge that I wasted precious years." Today, Thomas began his seminar. We're discussing Schopenhauer's concept of the veil, of Maya, the illusion that separates us from the true nature of reality. But I want to begin with a confession. I've been complicit in perpetuating a particular kind of illusion in this seminar. A murmur ran through the class. Elise watched him intently. "Philosophy is never created in a vacuum," Thomas continued. Schopenhauer's views on women and desire were profoundly shaped by his troubled relationships and the gender norms of his time. When he characterized female desire as destructive, he was projecting his own fears and resentments. He held up his grandfather's annotated volume. "This book contains a dialogue spanning decades, my grandfather's evolving relationship with Schopenhauer's ideas, influenced by his relationship with a brilliant philosopher named Margaret Eisler." The discussion that followed was the most engaged of the semester, with students offering perspectives that ranged from philosophical to psychological to personal. After class, Elise approached. "That was brave," she said, "acknowledging your own perspective and how it's shaped your teaching." "It was necessary," Thomas replied. "I've been reading my grandfather's journals. He regretted the years he spent afraid of fully committing to their relationship. I don't want to make the same mistake." Spring transformed the university campus as Thomas and Elise sat on a bench in the botanical garden, discussing their progress on completing the manuscript. "Your grandfather and Margaret were developing something truly original," Elise said. "They weren't just critiquing Schopenhauer's views on gender. They were reinterpreting his entire philosophy of will through the lens of compassion." Thomas nodded. Schopenhauer believed compassion was the basis of ethics, the one way humans could transcend the selfish demands of the will, but he never fully reconciled this with his views on desire. Exactly. Margaret argued that desire itself could be compassionate, that the will could be expressed through connection rather than competition. Over the weeks of their collaboration, their relationship had evolved from professor and student to intellectual partners. Thomas found himself looking forward to their discussions, valuing her challenges to his thinking and appreciating the way she helped him see familiar concepts from new perspectives. "We should include a chapter on how personal experience shapes philosophical interpretation," he suggested, "using my grandfather and Margaret as a case study, and perhaps ourselves as well?" Elise asked with a slight smile. The university auditorium was filled for the annual philosophy department symposium. Thomas stood at the podium, the completed manuscript before him, Elise seated in the front row. "Desire has been viewed with suspicion throughout much of philosophical history," he began. "Today, we present a different perspective, one that acknowledges desire's power while challenging the assumption that it is inherently destructive." He outlined the core arguments of the eyes, redemption of desire, explaining how his grandfather and Margarete had begun a philosophical dialogue that spanned decades. critiquing Schopenhauer's gendered view of desire while building upon his insights about will and representation. Elise joined him for the second part of the presentation, discussing how they had completed the manuscript by integrating contemporary perspectives. Desire becomes destructive when we fear it, deny it, or use it to control others, she explained. But desire can also connect us, inspire us, and drive us toward compassion when we recognize our shared vulnerability to the will. 1 year later, Thomas stood in the university botanical garden where a small ceremony was underway. A bench was being dedicated to the memory of his grandfather and Margaret Eisler, placed near a plaque that displayed a quote from their completed manuscript. "It is not desire that destroys, but fear of it." The university had established an archive collection dedicated to their work, and The Redemption of Desire had been published to critical acclaim in philosophical circles. As the small crowd dispersed, Elise joined Thomas by the bench. Their professional collaboration had gradually evolved into something deeper, though both approached it with the philosophical caution they had studied so thoroughly. "What would Schopenhauer say about us, do you think?" Elise asked with a smile. "He would warn us that all desire leads to suffering," Thomas replied, taking her hand. "And your grandfather?" she asked. Thomas looked at the plaque, thinking of the journals he'd read, the decades of intellectual passion and personal regret. "He would tell us that the only true suffering comes from denying what we truly desire out of fear." As they walked together through the garden where their journey had begun, Thomas reflected on how philosophy had finally led him not away from life, but toward it. Schopenhauer had been wrong about female desire being uniquely destructive, but perhaps right about something more fundamental, that in understanding the nature of will, we might find a path to its transcendence, not through denial, but through compassionate embrace.